Assalamu alaikum. It is extremely difficult to follow up on what we have just heard from Ms. Mushal Malik and a personalized first-hand experience of this very tragic situation that has existed in occupied Kashmir. Also, this is a subject on which a lot has been said, but so I will try and keep my remarks to the point and also try and avoid covering areas or issues that have already been covered by previous speakers. First of all, let me thank the CGSS for inviting me to speak at this very important event. I want to begin by underlining some basic realities that are very relevant to this entire discussion on Indian occupation of Kashmir, the plight of Kashmiris, and how to find a solution. The first and foremost fact that we must remember, we know this, but we must remember that the United Nations Security Council resolutions, which called for a plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir, despite almost 7 decades of being in existence or since their adoption, are still valid. You hear a lot of people who argue that UN resolutions are now outdated, the international community has moved on, the ground situation is different, but this is incorrect and we should not accept this argument. The only way UN resolutions will become invalid is when there is a succeeding resolution that makes those resolutions invalid. So until that happens, those resolutions are still very valid and a part of the international humanitarian and human rights law, as well as political decisions by the UN's peacekeeping operations and peacekeeping responsibilities. The second point is that there are at least 2 bilateral agreements between India and Pakistan that recognize that Kashmir is a dispute. The first is Shimla, and the second is the Lahore Agreement. Both recognize that Kashmir is a disputed area and this is an issue that needs to be resolved. Third point, which is something that India makes most of the time, that Kashmir after Simla is a bilateral issue and needs a bilateral solution and it cannot be raised in international forums. That again is wrong, because in Simla itself it is envisaged that this agreement or any other bilateral agreement does not overtake or make irrelevant decisions of the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly. And the fourth point that is very relevant, and Mr. Sufi referred to it as well, but he referred to it from a legalistic point of view, but also from a political point of view, because there are UN resolutions that recognize the right of people under foreign occupation or alien domination to fight or engage in a legitimate struggle for their freedom, and that legitimate right cannot be equated with terrorism. So we need to make these 4 points need to be made very clear, and they should be very clear to us as well in Pakistan. Now coming to the actual issue of the plight of the Kashmiris, we have heard this, and as I said, I cannot compare with what we have heard from the previous speaker, but in my recollection, I was in our embassy in New Delhi as a counselor when the 1990 Kashmiri movement started. And since that time to the present, several generations have come and gone in Kashmir who have continued this struggle without any weakening or without any compromise in this regard. And from that time, I remember very well, January of 1990, when the then government of India imposed governor's rule and appointed Mr. Jagmohan as the governor of Kashmir, and he unleashed a wave of terror and brutality on the people of Kashmir, that kind of wave of terror and brutality has only increased, it has never decreased. So we are now faced whereby over 70 years, but particularly since 1990, there have been a systematic use of human rights violations as instruments of policy. This has a pattern of gross violations, which at the end last year could not even escape a United Nations which has till now been forced to look the other way by the major powers. Because last year the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights adopted a report in which the most significant aspect was that it called upon India to fully respect the right of self-determination of the people of Kashmir as protected under international law. This was important because this, since the UN resolutions, is the first UN document which highlights the right of self-determination of the Kashmiri people. This document went on to list a horrific list of human rights violations. And I'll read them out because it's very important to recognize what those violations are, as recognized by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Denial of access to justice and impunity for Indian security forces due to laws such as the Armed Forces Jammu and Kashmir Special Powers Act and the Jammu and Kashmir Public Safety Act. Use of military courts and tribunals which have not convicted even a single soldier for human rights violations. Illegal administrative detention without due process. Excessive use of force against civilians, such as the use of pellet guns, including against minors and females. Deliberate shooting at and killing of protesters at peaceful rallies and funerals, arbitrary arrests and detention, including of children. Use of torture, enforced disappearances of at least 8,000 people since 1989. Denial of access to health and education, restriction on the right to freedom of expression, reprisals against human rights defenders and restrictions on journalists, and most importantly and most disgustingly, use of rape as an instrument of policy. Torture and reprisals by security forces such as the Kunan Pashpura incident, leading to over 143 cases of sexual violence. This is the United Nations indictment of India. But despite the fact that over the years, especially since 1990, when there have been 700,000 Indian troops deployed in Indian occupied Kashmir, and where between 70,000 to 100,000 people have been killed and many thousands more have been injured, the Indian government has engaged in increasing spirals of violence, which has reached its worst under the last 5 years of the Modi government, where we have seen the use of pellet guns, where we have seen the use of human shields, and where an army officer or officers using human beings as shields have been actually decorated by the Indian Army Chief. This is despicable. For any civilized, for any country or any people which claims to be civilized, this is despicable behavior. Now let us consider why nothing is being done about it. And unfortunately, and I know my friend Emir Bilal Sufi talked about the legal aspects. But the unfortunate fact of life is that international law has no implementation machinery nor implementation force. The UN resolutions were adopted not under Chapter 7, which would have required mandatory action, and therefore the resolutions have never been implemented. The reality is that in this world, realpolitik takes precedence over law or humanity or even human rights. And the reality is that there is discrimination, especially by those powers in the world that consider themselves as the foremost advocates of human rights. But in the case of Kashmir, as also in the case of Palestine, there is no application of these very same principles to protect these populations of Kashmiris and Palestinians from the kind of repression that has been, such as in East Timor or South Sudan. Then the issues of integrity and territorial integrity and sovereignty of countries has no meaning for these countries. As you all know, Indonesia was compelled to allow the Christians of East Timor to secede from Indonesia, just as the people of South Sudan were facilitated in seceding from Sudan. So when it comes to Muslims, there is a different standard of approach, at least as we see in the context of Kashmir and Palestine. Principles of human rights and freedom and justice and law have also been sacrificed at the altar of profit and commercial gain. India's very important asset is the fact that it is a big economic market for the Western countries particularly, and they do not want to upset the Indians by pursuing and following up on their commitments to human rights and other principles. So these principles have been sacrificed at the altar of profit. Another factor for which the Indians have successfully managed to turn international opinion in their favor is the identification of the Kashmiri struggle with terrorism. And this has happened particularly after 9/11, when it was in and remains in the interest of the United States and its allies in the West to denigrate Islam, denigrate Muslims, and to treat terrorism as a Muslim phenomenon. Whereas in fact terrorism has no religion, nor does it have any borders, and terrorism is a tactic which has been used by different people, including by the Jews, by the Buddhists, the Tamils in Sri Lanka, and the Buddhists, yes, in Myanmar, and so many other places where terrorism has been used but has never been described, even by Christians or Catholic terrorists in Northern Ireland, but it has never been described according to their religious denomination. Only in the case of the Muslims has terrorism been assigned to them as a religious identity. So there is a bias, there is a Western bias against Muslims, and that is why the Kashmiri struggle, unfortunately, is being seen in the context of the rubric or the prism of terrorism. This has been, to a certain extent, enhanced by the mistakes of what I call the so-called jihadi groups, which tried to unfortunately hijack the Kashmiri movement. The Kashmiri movement was based for the realization of their right of self-determination by the JKLF, the Hurriyat and others. But then extraneous groups hijacked this movement, which led to the use of kidnappings and other forms of terrorism, and the Kashmiri struggle became demonized as a result of this involvement and interference by people. And the latest case, whether it was true or not, but the argument that the person who attacked the Indian convoy in Pulwama belonged to a jihadi group or not is a point that will not be known. But certainly someone claimed that it was their action, and no one denied it. And therefore, it became easier for the Indians to project the incident at Pulwama, which in my view was a perfectly legitimate act of defiance and self-defense by a Kashmiri mujahid against Indian occupation forces, and a legitimate act of struggle, was demonized and projected as an act of terrorism. So this is also a factor. And final factor for this is our own failure, unfortunately, and Basit has emphasized that part, so I will not. I don't know whether this is just as well. I can't see my notes. So, but we have ourselves to blame to a very great extent, because, as Basit said, and I agree with him, we have not pursued a coherent Kashmir policy. We have reverted to Kashmir in bursts and starts. When something happens, our leaderships make statements about Kashmir. But as an insider, as a former insider who worked on this issue as a Director General for South Asia, and as someone who was based in Delhi, I know that we have at many times sought the easy way out, not to confront the Indian leadership. I have actually seen some of our leaders delete references that would embarrass the Indians. And we have fallen into this trap, which is self-made, that we want to have a dialogue with India. No one really thinks as to what is this dialogue going to achieve. Is this dialogue going to be about a realistic solution of the Kashmir issue or not? And if this is not a dialogue that is going to address and find a solution of the Kashmir issue, what is the point of such a dialogue? Because what the Indians want, and I've always pursued this objective and I've seen it firsthand, they want to engage in a dialogue because they can tell the rest of the world, you don't need to interfere, we are talking to the Pakistanis, we will solve our problems bilaterally, the international community doesn't need to get involved. And they did it specifically when the Kashmir issue came up at international forums. I remember this in the General Assembly, I remember this in the Human Rights Council. Whenever Pakistan brought a resolution relating to Kashmir, all pressure built on Pakistan, withdraw your resolution, we will bring the Indians to the negotiating table, don't pursue this resolution. And we fell for this trap every time. This is our fault. And we are still talking about, I don't know what inside information the present Prime Minister has when he says that Mr. Modi is going to be good for a dialogue, for a settlement in Kashmir. I don't know what he knows. But from what I know about Mr. Modi and about the BJP, he's not ready to find a solution to the Kashmir issue. So I think we are just fooling ourselves by trying to pretend that we will have a dialogue with this butcher of Gujarat. There is no possibility of having a dialogue with a person like this. If there is a dialogue, it will only be meant to divert the attention from Kashmir to other issues. And again, we will be falling into the same trap. So what is the way forward? I think the way forward is for us to get our act together in simple words, in simple terms. We need to have a coherent Kashmir policy. We need to know what we want. Do we want a solution, or we want Kashmir to remain the way it is, and we just make these occasional statements in favor of the Kashmiri people? If we want a solution in Kashmir, then we need to project this cause internationally, and we need to go beyond governments. We know that governments which have business dealings and strategic interests with India are not going to take any real steps. But we need to go to the people. We need to go to the parliamentarians. We need to address the media, the NGOs, the civil society. And this needs to be done by Pakistan, not just the government, but also by our own civil societies, by our own parliamentarians. But it's a measure of our lack of seriousness. Forgive me for those people who have a good opinion of him, but I think that in the past, when the Kashmir Committee was headed by a person like Maulana Fazlur Rahman, that's the wrong kind of person that you want to send abroad to plead the Kashmir cause. He simply was not interested. All these people in the past, I don't know what will happen in the future, but all these people in the past who, first of all, they only wanted to go to the West because that's a good junket. You go to America, go to England, go to France, one of these European countries. Nobody wanted to go to Africa. Nobody wanted to go to Latin America, Southeast Asia. These countries have the same number of votes as the US or France or Britain. But they wanted to go on a junket. So this is one thing that we need to end this junket business, and actually be serious about people who are in our parliament and elsewhere who are going to pursue these things. And the second thing is that you send people who have no idea what they're going to say. If you remember, there was a member of parliament in the previous parliament who was asked to go abroad, and when he was interviewed on television about what he's going to say, he didn't even know what the Kashmir issue was. It's pathetic the way that we have pursued this. So I will end on this note that we have to get our act together. Thank you very much.